It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good morning. Scott Luton here with you on Supply Chain Now. Welcome back to the show. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about hurricane season, which is just around the corner. And as we've seen time and time again, hurricanes pose significant challenges for global supply chains. But today, we're going to be offering insights, observations, and resources that will help you better manage and mitigate the risk ahead. So stay tuned as we look to increase your supply chain leadership IQ. Quick programming note before we get started here today. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. All right, so I want to welcome in our featured guests here today. First up, Shehrina Kamal, Product Director, Risk Intelligence with Resilience360. Shehrina, good morning.
Good morning.
So great to have you back. We always love to have repeat guests back. Got so much good feedback from the webinars and podcasts you joined us on. Great to have you back here on this episode. And you're joined by none other than Jon Davis, Chief Meteorologist with Riskpulse. Jon, good morning.
Well, good morning, Scott.
I'll tell you, it's not every day we get a chance to interact with a chief meteorologist that knows supply chain here at Supply Chain Now. So looking forward to picking your brain.
Likewise.
All right. So before we dive in, let's set the table a little bit and really establish a backdrop a bit. So great to have you both on the show. As we mentioned, Shehrina, we love our repeat guests. But let's give today's audience an opportunity to get to know you both a little bit better. So, Shehrina, let's start with you. Let's refresh our audience's memory. Let's talk about where you're from and give us a story or two from your upbringing.
Great. So, Scott, thanks for having me back. It's always great fun to be on these conversations. I'm originally from Bangladesh, and I've lived and worked in 3 continents and am now currently based out of Cologne, Germany. So growing up in Bangladesh has shown me the incredible devastation that natural disasters can have on local population, infrastructure, and businesses. And what really fascinated me as I got older was learning how Bangladesh has exceedingly improved on its disaster management abilities in the last 30-odd years. And much of its experiences are learned in disaster management courses worldwide now. And that's something I've tried to carry into my professional life as well, trying to understand and address supply chain disruptions in the context of limited but efficiently managed resources.
What a great personal connection there. And I'd love to, I'll tell you, in the future episode, we're going to have to dive into a case study of how Bangladesh has been able to do that. Really quick, before we switch over to Jon, give us just a Reader's Digest version, just maybe a couple of key aspects of your professional journey leading up to your current role.
So I'm an economist by education and a supply chain professional by trade. I've been part of the logistics industry for more than 11 years. I started my career in roles spanning development consultancy, communication, logistics innovation, and found myself drawn to this new startup we were incubating at Deutsche Post DHL 8 years ago to address customer concerns around managing supply chain risks. And here I am today talking to you.
Love it. And talking to us for a third or fourth time. We've enjoyed each one of those. All right, so let's switch gears over to Jon Davis. Jon, tell us a little bit about where you're from, and you got to give us the goods on your upbringing a little bit.
Sure. So I grew up in the Chicago area and then went to college in Madison, Wisconsin. Spent 5 years in New York out of college, then back to Chicago for most of my working career. And then just about 9 months ago, my family and we moved to Barcelona, Spain. So most of my time has been in Chicago, but then kind of now in Barcelona as we moved last August here from Chicago to Barcelona. I guess kind of thinking back a little bit from a standpoint of kind of my upbringing is that I spent all my summers as a kid on the family farms back in South Dakota. My parents were both farm kids from South Dakota. They both became high school English teachers, moved to Chicago. That's where the jobs were. But all the summers were kind of out on the farm, on the family farms. And it was all of those years kind of watching weather, just incredible things that I would see. And that's kind of how I got the weather bug. And as many meteorologists are, kind of a weather nerd. And so I'm one of those individuals that, from the time I was 5 years old, the only thing I ever wanted to do is be a meteorologist. So, and I still do that today. So kind of my hobby is my profession and, beyond that. So.
Love that. Wow. And I spent a couple years in Wichita, Kansas, and I'm a bit of a weather nerd as well, and it is fascinating. The Midwest of the country, from a weather standpoint, is just absolutely intriguing. Hey, real quick, 2 quick questions, John, as we close out this first segment. First up, being from Chicago, White Sox or Cubs?
Cubs.
Cubs. Okay. All right. And then more importantly, you're talking about some of your recent moves and certainly your passion. Give us just, like Shehrina did, in a nutshell, your professional journey leading up to your current role.
Sure. I graduated college. I've been in 1985. So I went right from college in Madison, Wisconsin. My background's all meteorology, then went right to Wall Street. So I spent 18 years at the commodity divisions of Citigroup and never thought I would leave there. And at the end of that, then I was chief meteorologist for Citigroup, kind of looking mainly at agriculture, energy, risk management. And then after that 18 years, I spent 10 years at Chesapeake Energy, kind of involved in their hedging operations and all their kind of weather decision-making that they had at Chesapeake, kind of on the physical side, if you will. And then after that, the last 6 or 7 years then have been at Riskpulse. So I'm in kind of my 35th or more year from that, but I've really kind of done the same general thing. And again, it gets down to applied meteorology, applying weather and climate to things like supply chain, like energy, like agriculture, and that's really been my focus and my forte.
Love that. Okay. All right. So before we dive into what I'm sure is going to be a ton of expert insights and perspectives, let's get to know your organizations a little bit better, especially for our audience. So Shehrina, we'll start with you. Tell us more about Resilience360.
So in a nutshell, Resilience360 helps customers answer questions such as, where do I need to invest my risk management efforts? Even the most resource-heavy organizations need to find a way to prioritize. And by acquiring visibility into their supply chain networks, customers that are using Resilience360 try to figure out how to avoid supplier failures, avoid production outages, avoid lost sales, reduce premium freight costs, or maintain order volumes, and essentially limit reputational loss by staying ahead of supply chain disruptions.
Love that. It's a lot easier to manage all of those issues if you can avoid them altogether, right?
That's right.
It's the name of the game. All right. So, John, if you would do the same, tell us about Riskpulse.
Sure. Well, just a quick history on Riskpulse. So it's been around over 10 years and initially was devised as a hurricane tracking software company. There were no meteorologists there, but that's how it kind of started out. And it's changed and morphed over the last 6 or 8 years to get into other arenas. The big one really being supply chain or risk management in logistics. And that happened about 4 or 5 years ago when numerous companies came to us and they were losing product, actually beer in this case, during the cold winter of 13 and 14. It was so cold that the beer was blowing up in 6-packs and kegs, and they lost huge amounts of money, millions. And they came to us and said, can you help us manage that? So now we build software and we go through and we help clients detect, analyze, and then make decisions on their overall shipments and products, both domestically and globally.
Love that. And bringing it forward, I was reading just a week or so ago about a lot of the beer that's at risk today, given kind of the shelter-at-home conditions and the global pandemic and all the events that have been canceled. The beer that had been produced for a lot of that surge in demand and the events and you name it, a lot of that could be lost as well. So interesting times, especially in some of those sectors that could be in your blind spot, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So, Shehrina, interesting to me is the relationship between Resilience360 and Riskpulse, and how you team up to really serve the market, serve the industry. You know, tell us a little more about how you've seen organizations leverage the combined solution to fill gaps and, of course, drive success.
So we're very excited about bringing our unique strengths and coming together as one organization to help customers manage supply chain risks. John and his team have done some incredible work around weather analysis that is truly unique in the market. And Resilience 360 is pretty good at monitoring comprehensive risks across the world. So we're hoping that once the two organizations merge fully, our customers will have even more predictive capabilities around how natural disasters and weather affect their operations and build on their current risk management processes with a view to incorporate other issues such as, of course, a pandemic, trade wars, or port congestions that can impact supply chains.
Outstanding. Moving from the V6 to the V8, it sounds like. John, what have you seen in this regard?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to, and the thing that's really been evident over the last couple of months since we've gotten together, is that the people in both companies are so good and so talented. So on the 360 side, their expertise, Shehrina's team and others in the company, their expertise at supply chain logistics, overall global structure of what they do, and the background that they've had over the last 10 years to analyze data. And then you combine that with our data analytics and Riskpulse and the kind of weather and climate team here, and the people involved in that, you really have a powerful team here going forward, to help clients within the industry.
Outstanding. And that's the name of the game. All right, so let's switch gears here. I want to dive into today's primary topic and the primary segment of the conversation, and that is the 2020 hurricane season outlook special report. I want to get some background first, and I want to say, before we get started, Shehrina, I loved your personal connection, and both y'all had personal connection to weather and how that can impact business. I grew up in South Carolina. My dad spent over 30 years in the National Guard for the state of South Carolina, and clearly what still stands out in my childhood memory is Hurricane Hugo, which devastated the Charleston area back in 1989, I believe it was, and of course, my dad and his National Guard unit was called up to go in and clear roads and get massive trees off homes. I mean, it was just a devastating, one of those things that you just don't ever forget about. So fast forward to today, as weather has gotten more uncertain, certainly, and more disruptive. This is, I think, really a fascinating discussion we're poised to have here today. So, John, for starters, how did the idea for a co-authored report come about?
Well, we knew that the season was going to be incredibly unique, the most unique hurricane season we've ever had, because at a time when we're starting to recover over the summer and fall from what's happened with the pandemic, ongoing right now, you're going to have the added issue of disruptions from a tropical or hurricane standpoint out there. And in the last couple of months, we began talking about that integration or that interaction. So beginning to get out of, kind of a supply chain disruptions from COVID, and then getting into the hurricane season. And we thought that bringing both teams together and doing a report that talks about the integration of those two, again, probably the most unique situation we've ever been in, was a really good idea. And we bring the expertise of both teams in and do a webinar and report and so on and so forth. The timing was just perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's information. If you're a global supply chain leader looking to, going back to what Shehrina was talking about, avoid risk and as much as you can. And then when you have to engage it, manage it, and mitigate it, you've got to pay attention to the weather. So getting great insights on all the different risks that weather plays is intriguing. All right. So dealing with a hurricane by itself, though, is no easy task for an organization's supply chain, which is why we've got to get our finger on the pulse. So when you add in the fact that we'll also be dealing in this season with COVID-19 for some time to come, we all probably have talked about the new normal that will be. A lot of things will be much different in the immediate aftermath, and a lot of other things, unfortunately, may permanently change. So high probability that some part of the nation are going to be dealing with both disasters at the same time. Really, a high probability that many parts of the globe will be dealing with both disasters at the same time. So big potential for a multiplier effect. So Shehrina, can you walk us through some of the most challenging scenarios that organizations might face when dealing with both of these scenarios at the same time?
So, the most challenging aspect of dealing with this year's tropical storm season is that we're all only just getting used to the new normal that COVID-19 has established for us. Most organizations are still trying to figure out how to bring operations back online and ship their finished products to final destinations amid the challenges around limited cargo capacity. So, when you throw in a devastating tropical storm into that mix, which has the potential to shut down supplier locations once again, manufacturing operations in highly vulnerable areas will face a setback. Further to that, tropical storms can cause port closures in affected regions and subsequently port congestions. We've seen a number of ports, particularly in Asia, highly congested due to a lack of workforce as a result of COVID-19 quarantine measures imposed by local authorities. And all of this can really snowball into a much bigger issue.
Yep, and we're going to dive into a little bit more some of those things you mentioned about later in the episode. So, Jon, what would you add here?
Well, certainly some of the information that our clients have been sharing with us, some of the things that they're worried about, worker availability, which of course has been a major problem in things like some of the meat processing plants out there. And, if we do have an outbreak and processing plants close, and then you would combine that with a tropical system that has its own sets of challenges, again, a incredibly unique situation. The other issue is product availability. We've heard so much about the amount of products, all kinds of products that are not available due to various reasons, and those restrictions overall will be very challenging as you're trying to bring product in before a storm hits, water and things like that, and then after a storm hits in the recovery. So again, just an incredibly unique situation here coming up, and certainly every storm and the impact will be magnified this season all over the globe.
And that the interesting thing we've talked a lot about on a lot of our shows here at Supply Chain Now is the localization of hurricane damage or other natural disasters, and how the localization of that allows enterprises and supply chain organizations to reroute resources and whatnot. With the pandemic being the global impact, you don't have that same, oftentimes, you don't have the same flexibility, more or less. So these two massive challenges coming together is going to present some big obstacles here. All right, so Shehrina, now that we've talked about the multiplier effect, how do you think, two-part question here, how do you think managing the COVID-19 environment and the hurricane season and that hurricane threat will change the mindsets of business executives around supply chain management? And in particular, what do you think will get better or worse?
Yeah, so what COVID-19 has already demonstrated to business executives and supply chain practitioners is that risk management processes and tools are not simply nice to have. Sure, COVID-19 is a once in a lifetime kind of a disruption with no precedents in recent times, but tropical season comes around each year. If, as an organization, you're still not preparing for it in advance, there's a good chance that your competitors will and get ahead during a crisis. So many organizations already deal with multiple disruptions at the same time during the course of a year, and this will show that in order to be able to deal with it effectively, there has to be a cultural shift. And there has to be investments in processes, tools, and technology to help organizations manage these better. So while the outlook seems quite dismal at this point, I think this will be a way for organizations to realize how they can do things better in the future.
Jon, same question. How do you think the mindsets of business executives around the world supply chain risk management will change, and what's going to get better or worse?
Well, certainly with this unique situation upcoming, then decision makers out there are going to, more than any other time, have to react quickly and be very agile in making decisions. And certainly those companies that aren't good at those types of things will be the ones that are kind of left behind. As we've seen over the last couple of months, things change very rapidly. And the companies and the business leaders out there and the individuals that are making decisions will have to react very quickly to upcoming things going on, whether it's hurricane activity, whether it's product availability, and of all those things here together, firms are going to have to be extremely agile in their decision making, and you just can't wait around. You have to react very quickly.
Which is an even bigger imperative to make good data available right at your fingertips in the moment, just about, and all of the relevant data. That's some of the interesting things going back to our previous conversations with the Resilience360 team. Very interesting there. All right, so Jon, let's get your take on this. Do you think supply chain risk management will become a new heightened priority in the way businesses are run? We've spoke about how risk management in general has gotten a new seat at the table in the last, 10, 12 years, it seems to me at least. But, what's your take on an even new heightened role?
Oh, I think there's no question that the companies will have to look at things a different way from this point on. In other words, it's not going to be business as usual. So everything is different now. Everything has changed. And everything that happens from a standpoint of things beyond the pandemic will have heightened impacts and heightened risk out there. So I think overall here, companies coming up then are going to have to go through and certainly react to all those things upcoming. And I think that it's going to be a different world upcoming than anything that we've seen. And those changes, a lot of those will tend to be in how do you manage risk and how do you mitigate risk.
Interesting. Shehrina, your thoughts?
So let me start with one question, Scott. Remember the days when seatbelts were optional? That was a while ago, right? There's a reason why they're required by law now. So similarly, the pandemic and the hurricane season will help supply chain practitioners see that in order to build agile supply chains, managing risks and recovering from disruption is key. I truly hope that many organizations will bounce back from this pandemic despite the gloomy macroeconomic outlook we see today. When they do, supply chain risk management will have to become an integral part of supply chain operations.
It's interesting, the seatbelt example you use, the shifts in behavior, whether consumer or supply chain in general or supply chain leadership. It's always a fascinating, almost psychological study. All right, so moving right along, look, we all know that companies have dealt with and continue to deal with and will always deal with plenty of setbacks before, some more unique than others for sure. We can all remember what we lived through last year, for that matter. So Shehrina, to that end, two questions for you. What were the biggest supply chain impacts from 2019's hurricane season? And secondly, how were global companies forced to adjust to these supply chain risks in 2019?
Wow. So honestly, I sometimes have difficulty remembering what life was like before COVID-19.
Right.
But there were very few very significant tropical storms last year, like Cyclone Fani, Typhoon Lakima, and Mangut, as well as Hurricanes Dorian and Barry. And many of these had devastating impact on local infrastructure, caused extensive power outages, and resulted in flight cancellations and port closures. Hurricane Barry, for example, halted shipping on the lower sections of the Mississippi River for 2 full days. Hurricane Dorian, on the other hand, damaged over 250,000 homes and businesses in coastal areas, and they were left without power. Typhoon Faxai in Japan halted production at refineries, plastics, rubber, and electronics factories in Chiba Prefecture, which undoubtedly impacted the availability of materials and components downstream. And to answer your question about how global companies have been forced to adjust to these risks, we've seen companies use their visibility on port closures and congestions to either reroute shipments or expedite it through other means. Most notably, we've seen companies establish better processes to assess and analyze the impact of potential storm even before it hits. A key customer-driven feature that we've been developing for our solution is a what-if scenario analysis. This allows organizations to quickly assess which suppliers, transportation hubs, and shipments can be impacted as a result of an approaching storm so that they can analyze the product, revenue, and eventually the bottom line impact in their organization and quickly mobilize resources for locations that need to be prioritized. We've also seen from previous hurricane seasons that organizations, especially in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria that devastated Puerto Rico, have worked to build in contingencies in their operations, like having additional warehouse capacities to hold inventory on the U.S. mainland to minimize impacts from future hurricanes. So those are just some of the examples that we've seen, at least the customers that we work with take on.
It is interesting. I think a lot of folks have a hard time remembering back to the pre-pandemic environment. It's a great point. And right as you said, some of those storm names, it took me right back to how could I forget about some of these things? All right, so Jon, I think we have a little trivia question for our listeners, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how many of the top 10 ports globally that are at risk of tropical storms, how many of those top 10 are in the United States?
Actually, it's 0. So when you look at the globe and you look at tropical storm activity, it's the Western Pacific that is, in parentheses, the hotspot. It is the area of the world where there's more frequent tropical storm activity than any other area. So if you look at all the major ports on the globe, the top 10 are all in a relatively small area. Many of them in China, Taiwan, South Korea, and then to Sri Lanka and Thailand. There's not one in the United States. The next tier, the next 10, there's a couple of those in the United States, but in the top 10, they're all in East Asia.
Yeah, that's going to surprise a lot of folks, especially folks in the States, maybe arguably in the Southeast where, here we hear a lot about the growth of the Port of Savannah down there, right? And then for good reason. And that being on the Southeast coast, that's impacted with a lot of hurricanes. That really, your perspective there adds a lot more context to the conversation. So it's fascinating. All right, so Jon, equally as fascinating, I'm not sure, and I'm usually the last person to know sometimes, I'm not sure I've ever heard of supply chain companies using data analytics to determine what ports and airports are at the highest risk of tropical activity. It makes a lot of sense now as we uncover it now, but tell us more about that research and, of course, the ports themselves.
Yeah. So, back a couple of months ago when we were thinking about doing some things for the upcoming tropical season, we did have a couple of questions and we'd never seen the answer to this. For example, what is the one port around the world that has more risk than any other port? What is the number one airport for cargo that has more tropical storm risk than any other airport? So the team, we kind of got together and they said, with data analytics, we can look at this and we can determine, any lists out there. So what we did is we looked at what we call grid points. Think of that as like lat-long points. And in a lat-long point, that could be an airport, it could be a port, it could be a city, it could be any processing facility. And then on top of that, then we put in tropical historic activity, which we have large databases through our software that we can integrate that onto the lat-long situation. So for any point around the globe, we can get an idea of the hurricane risk, or is one station or point more or less vulnerable than other areas around the globe. Then we took the list of ports, for example, and then we can literally rank them from 1 to 20 or 1 to 50. And we did that for cities. We did that for airports from a cargo standpoint. And so through data analytics, we made those lists and we answered the question, what is the number one port of risk on a global basis? And actually, it's in southern Taiwan.
You have painted a perfect picture in my mind's eye as you describe that. I can see the matrix, Jon. I can see the matrix. And going back, when you just to clarify for our listeners, Line points, you're talking about latitudes and longitudes across the globe, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Yep. So it makes perfect sense now as you grid that out or map it out and map out all these locations and then overlay, tons and tons of historic tropical activity. That makes a ton of sense. So Shehrina, bringing you back into the conversation, hey, would you speak more to the closure periods and financial damages from all of this comprehensive research?
Yeah, so we've been crunching a lot of numbers just to kind of assess the kind of impact previous storms have had. And what we found was quite interesting, especially in light of what just John said. So in the Pacific, we've seen an average port closure periods of 1 to 3 days, whereas ports around the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, and the U.S. East Coast have a notably higher closure period, on average 9 days. And then for ports around the Indian Ocean, it is about an average 1 or 2 days. So, given that none of the top highest exposed ports are around the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the US East Coast, I find that very, very interesting. In terms of damages, Cyclone Fani that affected Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and India last year incurred about 8.1 billion US dollars in damages. Typhoon Lakima had similar financial impacts at 9.28 billion US dollars, where petrochemical, aluminum, and steel industries in Shandong province in China were impacted. And of course, who can forget Hurricane Dorian for its intense and unpredictable path? Had an overall financial impact of 4.68 billion in US dollars. And you can find a lot more of these impact data in our report that'll be out next week.
And there's some huge numbers, and the stories behind those huge numbers are even more intriguing and devastating. So, all right, so looking forward to the 2020 hurricane season outlook report, what can people hope to get out of the report? And John, we'll start with you there.
Yeah, a couple of different things. Number one, there's a large section on what we call climatology. Climatology meaning, what is the season like? When does it start? When does it end? When is the peak period? And we do that on a global basis for the Atlantic Basin, the East Pacific, the West Pacific, and also in the Indian Ocean. And with that climatology, again, we did that with data analytics. And with that climatology, that climatology can be looked at for years. So this is, a report that can be kept for a long time because it gives all the general specifics of each season in each area of the globe. Next, it's really the forecast. And we go through and we talk about the variables that will be important in determining what areas of the globe will tend to have a higher risk of tropical activity or a lower risk of tropical activity. And just to give a little hint here, Scott, there's some good news and there's some bad news.
Oh, hey, you know what? I love how you put that. But if you look hard enough, there's always some good news, and I'm really looking forward to this report. Hey, have you coined it the HSOR? Because we all love our acronyms in supply chain. Have we shortened it just yet, or is it still the full hurricane season outlook report?
I think we're still trying to figure out a catchy name for it. We're going to consider the acronym.
We'll take possibilities here, Scott. So,
okay. Hey, Shehrina, same question. I mean, it sounds like this report is going to be just chock full of really actionable insights and informative insights for a wide range of supply chain professionals and leaders. But what else sticks out to you?
So first of all, the tropical storm season is coming, regardless of whether we're paying attention to it or not. I really hope our readers will be able to use the report to get a better sense of the forecast for this year's season, thanks to the work that John and his team has been doing, and be able to assess where the highest impacts are from a supply chain perspective. I hope organizations will use this to proactively plan contingencies well before the tropical storm season starts.
Absolutely, that proactive planning. Planning arguably has never been as important as it is right now. And that might sound like a naive statement, but I think once all the data comes in from the pandemic environment we're in, and a lot of those hard assessments that have already started, but there's still some gaps, I think, in a lot of the data from the pandemic environment. So much more proactive planning is going to have to be done. All right, so let's talk about, Shehrina, I want to get you to weigh in here. What lessons should companies glean from COVID-19 that they can apply here to really this new challenge set before them?
Very simple. Expect the unexpected. No one saw a global pandemic coming, shutting down our everyday lives and integrated supply chains. So those that are doing relatively well and had early warning measures in place were able to react quickly. The same goes for tropical storms. No matter how predictable the season may appear, each storm system and its individual intensities as well as impact can vary. So companies should really be prepared with contingency planning, of course, but should also be ready to adapt where necessary.
Excellent. Jon, how about you? Same question.
Yeah, I think the thing that's been the biggest surprise here to me is the fact is how vulnerable or fragile the supply chain has been. As Shehrina said, no one expected this, 6 months ago, but we certainly have found out in the last couple of months the kind of disruptions that we had globally and really how vulnerable the supply chain is out there. And I think as we look ahead to the tropical storm season, it's really the things that are the most important thing are the surprises. There are certainly things the last couple of months that have been a surprise as the pandemic and the impacts have played out. There will be that also in the tropical season here upcoming. And again, as Shehrina said, be ready for the surprises, the things that are unexpected, because those are the items that at times can have some of the biggest impacts.
Yeah, great point there. Okay, so I want to shift gears a bit here, Jon. I want to stick with you for a minute because, from what I've been observing and tracking, it appears that Riskpulse is really doing some big things, driving innovation in supply chain. So, hey, look, for the non-data scientists like myself, I'd like to better understand a few components, in the equation. So, Jon, first up, how is the data gathered and used to determine the areas for, the most tropical activity?
Well, what we do is there are large databases out there that cover tropical activity to a specific degree. Those databases go back 50 years. There's other databases that go back 100 years. So we can take that information of intensity and tracks in exactly where a storm tends to hit an area or not, and then we can download that into our software. Then we can analyze that, and this is kind of classic applied meteorology. We can look at that data and then do things with it. We can talk about the things we discussed before as to the risk at specific locations around the globe, but we can also look at trends that are changing with time. There have been some interesting trends in the last 10 or 15 years that are a little bit different than they used to be. And so some areas tend to have more or less risk because of that. And on a global basis, each of the main basins out there, whether it's the Westpac, the most active hurricane area or tropical cyclone area in the world, or the Atlantic, in all of those areas, you can get a pretty good idea of how things are changing with over time. So it really comes down to taking all the data out there, and there's many different sources for that data, laying that data down, looking at specifics of tropical activity, or what water temperatures are as storms travel over them, and then comparing that and relaying it here to different issues out there, whether that's supply chain issues, whether it's areas, impacts on land, and different things like that. But it all comes down to data analytics.
As often so many things are these days. So you touched on this a little bit here, but what makes this data different than the data that is already out in industry?
Well, it's really the integration of that here coming up. So you can get databases where you look at tropical activity, for example, but it's really what you do with that information. So I'll give you an example. So from a forecasting standpoint out there, we can take the data of tropical activity and then overlay that with ocean water temperatures, the fuel that storms tend to get overall, and then we can look at how that impacts overall storm development or how rapidly a storm tends to intensify, and we can integrate those data sets together to get a good idea from a forecasting standpoint as to what may happen in similar situations as we go through the next tropical storm season. And that information then can be relayed, to the clients out there.
All right. So no spoilers here, right? We don't want to give away the goods, but just give us a few. Tease us a little bit here, Jon. What are some of these top places that you list in the 2020 hurricane season outlook report?
Sure. So from a standpoint of the top places kind of out there and some of the areas, so let's take a look at airports. So we looked at all the airports via cargo, and the number one airport in the globe, cargo-wise, that has the highest risk of tropical activity, it's Hong Kong. And so that is the number one airport out there from a standpoint of, risk of cargo and interruptions here from a standpoint of during the tropical season. What's interesting about that list, there is a U.S. airport in the top 10. Of course, most of them in the West Pacific, but Miami is in the top 10 of the airports here ranked by cargo. And again, we'll kind of finish up with a U.S. situation. We did look at all the U.S. ports out there, and we ranked them by tropical storm risk. And certainly not a surprise, but the port or city with the highest risk of tropical activity, a lot of your listeners can probably guess this, would be New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, I certainly hope they are spared after the recent challenges they've had there in recent years. But really appreciate you sharing some of the things that folks can certainly glean from this report. All right. So as we look to start to wrap up the interview, I want to wrap up on these last couple of questions here. And Shehrina, we'll start with you. How will global companies need to mitigate these hurricane risks moving forward in 2020 beyond what we've already kind of shared? And of course, if there's one phrase that will be between my ears leaving this conversation, expect the unexpected, a la Big Brother. But how can global companies take the additional steps to mitigate these risks?
So firstly, know where you operate, where you have supplier locations, and which transportation modes and hubs you typically use. That can be a deceptively easy-sounding task, but many companies fall short in acquiring this visibility. Secondly, make sure that locations and supply chain entities that are exposed to the storms have contingency plans in place. On a very basic level, consider this. Do you have backup generators? Do you have communication mechanisms established if the site is affected? Do you know your inventory levels in any given location? On a more strategic level, consider questions like, do you have alternate suppliers in place should a critical supplier be affected? Do you have mechanisms in place to take quick decisions on moving critical cargo in case you need to expedite shipments prior to a storm making landfall? And finally, monitor storm system movements in real time. The path can change frequently, as we saw with Hurricane Dorian last year, so keeping abreast of updated information will be necessary.
Yeah, good stuff there. Hey, Jon, same question. How will global companies need to mitigate these hurricane risks moving forward in 2020?
Yeah, just really adding to Shehrina's comments. Again, it really is kind of keeping up and planning ahead, for possible scenarios as we go through the season. And as fast as things happen, like even more so nowadays than it seems like they used to be, if you have a plan going forward, let's say if a system impacts the east coast of the U.S. or impacts the coastal areas of China, you're that much better off from a standpoint of planning ahead of time and mitigating some of that risk here overall. And once you get in the season, if you have a good plan pre-season, then it's much easier to deal with those situations. And as we go through, it really comes down to, detecting or making a plan and then analyzing risks as we go through and then having time to decide and mitigate that risk as a tropical system is getting close to an area or impacting an area.
Yeah, great stuff there. That if you can, the more minutes or hours of time you can add to make decisions, that is such a luxury in today's environment, right, Jon?
Oh, no question. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So, Shehrina, before we make sure our audience knows how to follow up with both you and Jon, so as the COVID-19 recovery takes place, I know we all want to be in that recovery phase as soon as we can, even if it is going to be presenting new challenges and a different new normal. We want to get there soon. How should companies prepare their supply chain to mitigate the impact of tropical storms on their business beyond what you've already shared?
So, Scott, recovery from COVID-19 is something we should be cautiously optimistic about. As governments around the world ease restrictions on lockdowns and economies restart their engines, there's a very real worry that a second wave of infections can undo all the great work that has gone into managing the pandemic. So the situation is far from over. Organizations need to make sure they've got their eyes on developments on both fronts as we approach the start of the tropical storm season. This can be done by combining supply chain data like locations of your suppliers, warehouses, ports, and airports with tropical storm data, as well as COVID-19 case data, as well as lockdown and restrictions imposed by authorities. Organizations should also consider cross-functional team setups across procurement, transportation, compliance, and business continuity to ensure that there is a cohesive and collaborative response in place as an organization to the disruptions.
Love that. And, as important as we have talked through today of using these insights from the report and a lot of other data analytics that are out there that your team provides and other to protect supply chain operations, it's equally, if not even a lot more important, to take care of the supply chain workforce, whether that's protecting them, insulating them from the pandemic, COVID-19 conditions and environment, or these natural disasters and hurricane season themselves and what they pose. So, the tough times ahead for sure. And Shehrina, I like your point made, data-driven, mind you, about the second wave and the threat that is, not just here in the States, but globally. All right, so let's make sure our audience knows how to reach back out to each of you and learn more about your respective organizations in the combined enterprise. So Jon, how can folks, check in on Riskpulse and also connect with you?
Yeah, on our website is riskpulse.com, so real easy, and all the information is on there, and there's a way to connect. So any questions anyone has, please feel free to reach out.
And Jon, we've got an upcoming webinar, I think May 14th, that's going to offer some of the highlights of this report, right?
That's right. So that will be next Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And so individuals it'll be on our website, the invitation, so people can go out and they can sign up for that. And if you do want an invitation to that, then we can certainly send that to you. And on the websites of either company, then you can go through there and get the sign-up form here for that webinar. But yeah, it'll be a week from today, May 14th at 11 a.m. Eastern.
Outstanding. And having been a participant and a collaborator in a previous Riskpulse Resilience360 webinar, hope folks are bringing their legal pads because it's chock full of information that you want to capture. And we'll make it even easier. We're going to put the direct link to the webinar in the show notes of this episode, so make it really easy for folks to plug in with that. All right, so Shehrina, how can folks learn more about Resilience360 and connect with you?
So you can follow the Resilience360 page on LinkedIn and Twitter for updates on our latest reports and insights. We're also conducting weekly webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on supply chains, which you can sign up to on our website, resilience360.dhl.com. And on a personal level, I'm also happy to connect with our listeners on LinkedIn.
Outstanding. Well, really have enjoyed these conversations. We made it through a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but really looking forward to the 2020 hurricane season outlook report and all the insights that will offer. So appreciate your time today. So big thanks to our guest today, Shehrina Kamal, Product Director, Risk Intelligence with Resilience360, and Jon Davis, Chief Meteorologist with Riskpulse. Thanks so much for your time. Okay, So lastly, to our audience, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. A lot of practical insights, actionable insights, and even more is going to be included in the report we've talked about. Hope you can carve out some time to join us on May 14th for the webinar. I know I will be. So again, big thanks to our guests. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. Lastly, be sure to check out our wide variety of industry thought leadership at supplychainnowradio.com. Find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. On behalf of the entire team, Scott Luton, wishing you a successful week ahead. Stay safe and know this, brighter days certainly lie ahead. And we'll see you next time here on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.